So I hardly need to introduce Professor AC Grayling, but I will. In fact, Professor Grayling spoke at the first ever Leeds for Europe public meeting back in 2017 and really got us off to a flying start, and we've never looked back. So I don't know if you remember that, Anthony, but it was a good event, and gave us confidence to do more things like that when we were just starting out, and it's been very good since. So I hope you have some pride in your part in the birth of Leeds for Europe. Professor Grayling is the founder and principal of New College of Humanities at Northeastern University. That's actually Northeast America, isn't it? It's not Northeast England. So sorry, Yvonne Vanker. And is its Professor of Philosophy. He's also Supernumerary Fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, author of over 30 books of philosophy, biography, history of ideas and essays, and was for a number of years columnist on The Guardian, The Times and Prospect magazine. He has contributed to many leading newspapers in the UK, US, Australia, and to BBC Radio's 4, 3 and The World Service, which he did the annual Exchanges at the Frontier series. He's often been on television, twice been a judge on the Booker Prize, in 2014 serving as the chair of a judging panel. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a Vice President of Humanists UK, Patron of the Defence Humanists, Honorary President of the Secular Society, and a Patron of Dignity in Dying. And last but not least, he is a passionate and determined and relentless campaigner against the madness of Brexit and in favour of our eventual rejoining. So I will hand over to you, Professor Grayling. Thank you very much for joining us. And Professor Grayling will speak for about half an hour. During that time, you may raise questions, use the Q&A to raise questions, and please do upvote questions. I put your little thumb up against the questions that you want to be asked, because there'll obviously be limited time at the end for questions, and we'll try and ask the most popular ones. So over to you, Professor Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, and good evening, everybody. Well, it is such a high probability as to be a certainty that the UK, or the component nations of the UK, if the UK splits up in the intervening period, will be in the EU at some point. That is a moral certainty. The question is when, and the question is, can we make it sooner rather than later? Sooner because we want to diverge as little as possible from our European friends and neighbours, because the longer that we are out of the EU, the more damage, the more diminishment, the more diminution to us as a country and economy, to our position in the world, and to us, to the people of these islands, our prospects and possibilities, our children and grandchildren, and what they are able to do. So even though, if we just let the normal course of political events unfold over the next decade or two, with the change of fashions, the change of political personalities, the evolution, the pendulum swinging backwards and forwards in the political sense, and the fact that, I mean, remember, UKIP was a tiny little group of activists. Rejoiners are a huge number of people and very adamant about wanting to be part of the EU. So the impetus there would be, even if we just left things to unfold on their own, for rejoining the EU would probably make it happen sometime in the course of the next decade or two. But as I say, we don't want it to be that long. And there are definite things that we can do to make it much shorter. In fact, there is a route for us to get back into the EU. It will be one that we have to work hard to make happen. We have to win the argument, we have to do the work, but it can happen, and it could happen in a matter of 6 or 7 years. And that's what I want to explain to you tonight. And indeed, I want to urge everybody who feels as strongly as I do about the very great importance of our membership of the EU for all sorts of reasons, not just for the hard-nosed economic reasons, not just because I would love it if my offspring, if all my students had the opportunities that so many of us have enjoyed over the last few decades, but also because the EU is a tremendous imaginative project for peace, a new model of the way the world should comport itself. Look at the contrast with the United States and China, who are essentially 19th century states who think that economic power and military power have to go hand in hand. There have to be hegemons, they've got to be able to throw their weight around. And the EU does things very, very differently. I mean, one of the great things it does is it won't trade with anybody unless those people, those other countries, meet the high standards set on quality. I mean, that's just one example of the way that the EU can influence the world for good. The tremendous dedication with which the EU is now confronting the climate change problem, the fact that it wants to see a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030, again, sets the pace and gives a lead to the world. And this is a soft power lead, and we should be part of it. And when we look at the history of Europe over the last many, many centuries, one after another dreadful war, tearing the continent apart, a kind of internecine civil war, really, between the peoples of Europe over matters of religion, over matters of territory, vying for a foothold on the world stage during the period of colonization. And the founding fathers and mothers of the EU after the Second World War decided to take to heart and apply the lesson taught by Cobden and Bright, the free traders back in the 19th century, you may remember. Tom Paine, back at the end of the 18th century, said exactly the same thing, that if you get nations intimately connected with one another through trade, through exchanges, through political cooperation, through educational exchanges, they become so intertwined that they simply cannot go to war with one another. And the EU project, right at the very beginning with the Coal and Steel Union and all the development into the EEC and into the EU itself, has all been a tremendous project for peace, cooperation, development, and progress. And when we have our opportunity to argue again with people, and I think we should be doing it all the time, every opportunity, for reasons I will give you shortly, we should be pressing this part of the argument just as much as we press the argument about economics and about opportunities. Right. So now the key thing is this 6 or 7 year process that gets us back into the EU. It sounds, impossible. No, it isn't. It sounds difficult. Well, it will require work and dedication. And I think we should put our shoulders to the wheel and try and achieve it. And it goes as follows. We need to get electoral reform. That is an absolute urgency. Now, for those of us who are keen on rejoining the EU, getting electoral reform is the first step, because in a reformed parliament, in a genuinely representative parliament, in which the Lib Dems and Greens and SNP and others have a big influence over any coalition, they will be very responsive to the demand that we make for another say on European membership. And if there is another say on European membership, another referendum, if we get that opportunity, again, it is a moral certainty that we will win that referendum and we will be back in the EU. This is because we are now witness to the facts. When in 2016 there was no roadmap, no plan, no assessments, no evaluations, no numbers were crunched, no nothing was known about the effects of Brexit. And indeed, those studies were not done right up until the 1st of January this year, when the transition period ended and we were enjoying all the benefits and securities of being part of the EU until then. Right even until then, there had been no understanding of what the effects of Brexit would be. And just in these last 6 months, we've seen it unraveling. We've seen Northern Ireland being absolutely the flagship problem of what our difficulties are being outside the EU. We look at the way that although the COVID pandemic and all the tragedies associated with it are masking many of the effects of Brexit, this business of transport, of not having itinerant workers coming to help pick the crops in the farmers' fields, the fact that businesses are leaving, the fact that the Erasmus scheme has been brought to an end, that the numbers of students coming to us from the EU and our students going to Europe, that all this has crashed. the facts are coming home, all the birds are coming home to roost on this, and that if in a few years' time, 3, 4, 5 years' time, there was another opportunity to have a say on Europe, we could be very, very confident indeed that we could win that argument. So electoral reform, but now I must put this point to you, which is very important. Electoral reform is intrinsically urgent, independently of the question of rejoining the EU or what might happen after we get electoral reform. It is intrinsically urgent because we live in a broken system, a badly dysfunctional system, which is precisely what has brought this Brexit debacle on us in the first place. In the 2019 election, the Conservative Party won an 80-seat majority. That's a huge majority. That means Parliament is a rubber stamp mechanism for Boris Johnson's government. However much people might stand up on the opposition benches and argue, there is nothing they can do. They're impotent, they're powerless, because the whips just get the automatic vote through and the government can do absolutely what it likes. And there's no difference between our system and a tyranny once there is a large majority in the House of Commons. Between the Theresa May election of 2017 and the Johnson election of 2019, in those 2 years, we had a hung parliament. And that demonstrated itself as a very, very good thing, because every single measure that the government brought to the House had to win or had failed on its own merits in the debate. It wasn't just automatically swept through on a majority vote so that the executive could do just what it liked. The argument had to be won. The bills were scrutinized. There were a number of occasions when the government had to withdraw what it wanted to do because there just wasn't support for it. And that is how things should be. A legislature, a parliament, should hold the government to account, should scrutinize properly. Less time was given in the House of Commons to discussion of the Brexit deal than was given to debates in Parliament about the death of Prince Philip. And now there should therefore be no surprise that the Brexit deal is unraveling and unworkable, because it wasn't properly negotiated and it wasn't properly scrutinized. In fact, the European Parliament took several months of examination and discussion of the deal before it voted on it. And that's what should have happened with us. So we have a broken system here, and the centerpiece of this broken system is our first past the post voting. We only use first past the post for the House of Commons. Every other election is one or another form of proportional representation. Even the elections within the House of Commons for House of Commons select committees, the members of them and the chairpersons of them are elected on a proportional system. So it's not as though we don't know or use these systems, we do. But the first past the post system has been kept because it gives artificial majorities on minorities. In 2019, Boris Johnson got that massive 80-seat majority on 43% of actual votes cast, representing 29% of the electorate. 29% of the electorate, and therefore even less a proportion of the population as a whole. And on that basis, they are conducting this horrendous slow motion car crash of our country with this incompetent and corrupt set of processes, making COVID so much worse and making Brexit an even bigger disaster than it needed been. So you can see that this is an urgent matter. We have to do something about it. Now, there is a bit of good news here. The Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid, SNP, all in favor of proportional voting systems. On Monday of this week, the Make Votes Matter movement published a poll of Labour Party members, 83% of whom support proportional representation. So these are very good indications. Some unions, and unions, as you know, have half the vote in Labour Party conferences, are in favour of it. Some of the big unions haven't yet made up their mind. One big union has come out against it, incredibly. The Labour Party leadership has said nothing about quite where it is, although some people allege that Keir Starmer is more of and less sympathetic and may have said something about it in the past. But this conference coming up, this conference season for the Labour Party is a very crucial moment, because if the Labour Party were to commit itself to it, then there is real following wind for some form of platform on which all the opposition parties can agree for reform of the electoral system. Now, in the ideal, what we would like to see, in fact, is an alliance of all the opposition parties, just at least, very least, for the next election. They can go back to all the dreadful tribal squabbling, which has, resulted in one after another conservative government, in all the years since the Second World War and even before, because we have a problem here, which is that the centre-left on politics is so divided internally, and we have a problem with the Labour Party itself. And I speak as a person who admires some of the Labour Party principles, certainly, and some of the great Labour Party figures of the past. And I have been a member of the Labour Party. I'm not at the moment because I'm very disappointed with their timid and equivocal stance on Europe. But the trouble with the Labour Party, to be very, very frank, is that it is many internal parties. It is a bitterly internally divided organization. It is sclerotic in its organization and the way that it gets things done and chooses its policies. And it therefore makes it a very difficult beast as the biggest of the opposition parties to predict and to get to do the right thing. Certainly the right thing is for the Labour Party to be full-heartedly behind electoral reform. And indeed, from the point of view of sheer pragmatics, and this is a kind of footnote remark, without Scotland, Labour is never, ever again going to get a majority in the House of Commons on first past the post. The very best and most that Labour can hope for, and which we, as I think, as citizens of this country would perhaps quite like to see, is Labour Party being the lead party in coalition. Coalitions are very good things. I've mentioned what happened between May and Johnson. We've been told in this country for decades that coalitions are very bad and the first past the post is great because it gives so-called strong government, like the one that we have at the moment. But actually, coalitions are a very good thing. Among our European neighbours, they have proportional systems of voting, and it sometimes takes them weeks or months to form a government as a result. And we look down our noses at them and think this is absolutely awful. In fact, it's an incredibly good thing, because it means that when a government is formed, it's a government which is based upon a selection of those public policy initiatives and needs on which there can be agreement. Coalitions tend to bring the enactment of public policy back a bit more towards the centre, and the interests and the great diversity of interests and preferences in the country tend to find some expression in coalitions. Government is for all the people. Government is not for the people who voted for you, not for your faction, not for the people who are the leaders of your party, which is how things work here in the UK and in all the systems using first past the post. First past the post produces two-party divided politics. And when there are two parties, political discussion becomes sloganizing, divisions become very bitter. I mean, look at the way first past the post has driven the deepest and most bitter divisions in the United States of America. They are now in a form of political paralysis there because of the dreadful divisions, bitter divisions that there are between Democrats and Republicans there. The same is true in India, which is first past the post. Canada, less so, it also first past the post, but it has a federal system there and state governments, so that tends to dilute the problem. But here in the United Kingdom, we have what Lord Hailsham, a conservative politician, himself described as elective tyranny, and it is something which has not served us well. It has brought us down. It has brought about the situation that we're in now, and it has got to stop. So intrinsically, it's important. Therefore, we should be campaigning for electoral reform, and we should, while we are campaigning for it, while we are trying to get it to be the major policy issue at the next election, we should not couple it too closely to the matter of rejoining the EU, because there will be people who are very much in favor of electoral reform who are not so sure about the EU, or perhaps even against it. There may be some leavers who think that we should have a PR system of voting. So let's get PR, let's get electoral reform. And then when we have a reformed parliament, when we have a representative parliament, then we campaign extremely hard to be given another say now that we know the facts, now that the facts are in. and we can see for ourselves what it means, and we can speak clearly about what we want. And I am morally certain, again, that if we get a reform parliament, that it will be one that is receptive to the argument that we should have another say on Europe. Indeed, very receptive. No matter what the Labour Party might still be thinking and havering over, if they are part of a coalition and the coalition has Lib Dems and Greens in it, then we will fully and reasonably expect them to be very receptive to our demand for another say. Now, there are a couple of points that I want to connect with this. We have become far too used in this country to leaving things up to the leaderships of political parties to decide what direction the country is going to go in. And we simply cannot do this anymore. This neo-conservative party, this Johnson new UKIP Brexiter version of the Conservative Party, which by no stretch of the imagination is the Conservative Party of Dominic Grieve or Ken Clarke or Anna Soubry or Heseltine. It's a different party. It's a party which has been captured by the right wing, the Brexiter right wing. That group of people, Johnson, Gove, Rees-Mogg and all that crew, they're the ones who are deciding what happens, what the whole country, the entire population has to submit to in the way of their choices and interests. The Labour Party and its trades union supporters who provide most of the funding for the Labour Party, a group of men and women, are deciding what their policies will be, what they're prepared to offer us in the way of governance or direction. This has to stop. It would certainly stop in a regime of proportional representation, but it's got to stop now. It's got to stop now because we citizens have at long last really got to stand up and start saying to the members of all the political parties in our local area that we want electoral reform. Whether you're a member of the Conservatives or Labour Party or Lib Dems, it doesn't matter. Whether you're a member of no party, it doesn't matter. You should be incredibly active, arguing and demanding that there has to be cooperation, at very, very least cooperation in critical, important constituencies to ensure that there is not a Conservative government after the next election and that there is a coalition of opposition parties. And central to that must be the electoral reform platform and a commitment to holding another election as soon as Proportional Representation Act is in place. This is what we citizens should be arguing for. This has got to be citizen action now. We shouldn't any longer allow groups of leaders of political parties to say what they're prepared to offer in the way of policies. We should be the ones who are doing it. Now you may argue, well, why don't we just join the party and vote and so on? Well, if any of you ever been a member of a party and gone to a constituency meeting and just see that what you encounter is just endless arguments and walls of barriers between you and the leadership, not just of the party itself, but of the constituency party. I mean, political parties are so, I used the word sclerotic earlier on, it's particularly true of Labour, but all parties are like this. They're mechanisms, they have procedures that they've got to follow, votes they have to have, conference decisions, the parties themselves have to be democratic, an internal democracy, internal small scale democracy like that. It's very good because it airs lots of opinions and views and so on. But one of the outcomes is that it makes for great inflexibility in policy commitment on the part of parties. Therefore, we citizens, in or outside parties, we as a whole have got to mobilize. And we have to say loud and clear what it is we want. And there are lots of different ways that we can do this, but formal and informal citizens' assemblies are one very powerful way of doing it, even informal citizens' assemblies. And here I want to suggest to you two things. First, there is an organization called the Alliance for Europe, of which I'll declare an interest because I'm a member of its board. And it is a Europe-wide, that means the continent, not just the EU. It's a Europe-wide organization for citizens and for citizens to be able to have an input and to participate in decisions that are made at the supranational level across the continent of Europe, including the EU itself. And it is a very valuable organization because it has in it lots of resources, information, advice, and information about funding sources for citizens' action. So I would very strongly recommend that people in any local area find out about the Alliance for Europe, find out what resources it has, make use of those resources, learn from the advice, and take the opportunities that are on offer there. The second thing to remember in this connection is some of you will have in your Twitter thing or will have seen reference to 3.5%. 3.5% of any group of people, of your local community, of your city or town, of the population of a country can change everything, can get everything done. In fact, it probably took rather less than 3.5% of Brexiters to or organize matters to hijack the political process and to get a referendum and then to manipulate that referendum result. We can try to use the 3.5 and more % of people to make that kind of change in the opposite direction. And there are some things that we should remember. Just think, supposing we think of the process that we're going through now, the Brexit referendum, and then the end of the transition period and what's happening in the UK now and the current government that we have. Let's just sort of parallel it with what happened in the Second World War. It's as if the 2016 referendum were September 1939. And it is as if the 1st of January 2021, which is when the transition period ended, is the 10th of May 1940, which is when the war really began. So in fact, we are at an early stage of a fight, which we could win in the same length of time as the Second World War was won. From 1940 to 1945 is a period of 6 years in total. We can win in that same period of time if we are determined enough and we are prepared to put the effort in, as our fathers and grandfathers did back in the 1940s. We can do this. We can do it by being committed and by remembering something. The Brexit referendum, and people say, look, we can't refight the old battles and so on. It is not an old battle. It's now, it is present, and it is our future. And it is affecting what's happening to us now in our immediate future. What happened in 2016 was that 37% of the electorate, representing 26% of the population, voted to leave. Now, by no stretch of the imagination, is that anywhere near a constitutionally significant proportion of the electorate or population for so massive and consequential a change? Think of it. You know, and I think some of you will have heard me say this before, that it takes a minimum of 40% of the total membership of a trades union for a trades union to be able to call a strike legally. It takes 66% of all sitting MPs in the House of Commons to agree to an election if there is going to be an election outside the 5-year term of the Parliament. And by the way, that 66% was achieved back in November 2019, calling the general election that happened in December, when we were this close to stopping Brexit. That if only the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party had not agreed to an election, there would have been another referendum last year and we would not have left the EU. We were this close to stopping it. But because of our system and because of the, well, whatever you think about the leaderships of the Lib Dems and Labour at the time and their folly in agreeing to an election, I leave to you. But we came this close to stopping it. Now we've got to remember, therefore, that there is no constitutional legitimacy to the referendum outcome, even if the referendum itself had been held on a valid basis. And in two ways it wasn't. You know that there was a big debate in the run-up to the 2016 referendum, all about the referendum bill debated in the summer of 2015, a year before, in which it was said that the constituency for the referendum should include expats, British expats living abroad. It should include citizens of other EU countries living, paying their taxes in this country, married to British citizens, bringing up their children in Britain. They had a stake in the outcome. Their future was going to be affected. And my God, we've seen what effect it's had on our friends, neighbors, and kinfolk from Europe who have given their lives to the UK and lived here. They should have been included. And following the model of what happened in 2014 in the Scottish independence referendum, we should have given a say to 16 and 17-year-olds because their future was immediately affected by the outcome of the referendum. And had those three groups been included, there would have been no problem. We would have remained in the EU. But David Cameron said in public, it is on the public record, he said, he wasn't going to try and have an argument with the right wing of his party about giving the franchise to those groups because they were bitterly opposed, knowing that that reduced their chances. So he wasn't going to have that fight with them, and they weren't included. So that was one big problem. And the other big problem, of course, is the fraud committed by the Leave campaigns. They were fined in court subsequently. They were taken to court by the Electoral Commission because they behaved fraudulently. And the judge in the case said that if the referendum had been mandatory and not merely advisory, it would have had to be voided. So the situation that we're in at the moment is illegitimate. We're in an illegitimate situation. It has been brought about by the dysfunctional character of our constitutional arrangements here. Now, I don't want to drag in the need, although it is a very pressing one, but it is for the middle future, really, not for now, of a major constitutional reform that we have to have in this country. Because if you bring in reforming the House of Lords and the monarchy and the this, that, and the other, as well as electoral reform, you're going to get nothing done. You've got to focus on just one key thing, and that one key thing is electoral reform. So for us rejoiners, let us fight to get electoral reform. Let us force all the opposition parties to commit themselves to that and to agree to collaborate at least just at the next election to bring in this absolutely vital change because of the intrinsic importance of it. And then we as passionate Europeans, as rejoiners, we can then pile the pressure on to get another say, because we can be pretty confident that a reform parliament would give us that opportunity, would be receptive to that demand. So that's how I see it. Now just think, the next general election is sometime within the next 3 years. If that election were held on the basis of an agreement among all the opposition parties to share a platform on electoral reform, and they win, and they introduce an act, and the electoral reform is instituted, and another general election is held on that basis, then there could be a reformed, properly representative parliament in Westminster between 4 and 5 years' time. And in 4 or 5 years' time, the huge demand from us, a minimum of half the population, half the electorate, and very probably more, demanding another say on Europe, and we get that say, and we win that referendum, because we now know, back in 2016, people thought, nobody's going to be stupid enough to vote to leave the EU. So a lot of people didn't even bother to vote or bother to campaign or bother to put the arguments. But that mistake won't be made the next time. In 6 years' time, we could be talking to our EU neighbors and friends about rejoining. That is a real possibility. You may think it sounds, kind of utopian and so on. It isn't. It is a genuine possibility if we put the work, the energy, the commitment, and the desire into it. I urge you, therefore, to do this. I urge you to put your shoulders to that wheel and let's try and make it happen. Richard, over to the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you very much. And you said there would be some constructive suggestions and ideas, and you certainly delivered on that. It's a very forward-looking talk, and I think that's what we need at the moment. So, plenty of questions, tremendous. We've got over 30 questions. I'm afraid we're not going to get through them all, so I will not hold it up. I'm going to invite Peter Burke to ask his question first of all. So hopefully, Peter, you are now able to speak and read your question.
Hello, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
How are you doing? Yeah, so I have a question really about what I've had back from the electors on the doorsteps in recent elections. The number of people who are avowed former Remainers who will say to me that the decision's been made, democracy dictates that we have to respect the result of the referendum. And I say respect in quotation marks, and that it's unpatriotic in some way to oppose it. Now, my answer to that usually is to say, or to want to say that there has never been a greater traduction or abuse of democracy than happened in the referendum. But actually, I'd be interested in your views about what one can say that will persuade them, because I found them very difficult to persuade.
Well, I mean, that is exactly the right response. It is not by any stretch of the imagination democratically or constitutionally secure. The mechanisms that were involved and how the Leave campaign behaved, we've even seen an admission from Dominic Cummings, the man himself, just this week, that they knew that they were tricking the electors. And that they were chancing their arm with some of the things they said about Turkey, for example, 350 million a week, for example. They knew that. So the facts are out there. You might also say to people who say it was, well, it's all a done deal now. You say, no, it certainly isn't. It wasn't a done deal in 1939 or 1940. To be defeatist about it, not to realize that the longer this goes on, the more damage. Ask them to imagine, what if in 10 or 15 years' time, we were still outside the EU and we had become, well, what we are now? We're now the 6th biggest economy in the world. In 2016, at the time of the referendum, we were the 5th biggest economy, with everything that means, by the way, for jobs and job security, local communities, even with all the austerity that we've had since 2010. But think if we were the 20th biggest economy in the world, if we had sunk that far, and what that means to lives and livelihood and to opportunities. And ask them to imagine whether in terms of economic geography, this is sustainable. Ask them, isn't it inevitable that we're going to rejoin, sitting right on the doorstep of the biggest single market in the world, which has said to us, the door is open for whenever you want to come back? Would we be able to sustain ourselves outside? You say to them, this is not, the story is not over. We have an opportunity to get back in. And as somebody who wanted to be in, you should rejoin the fight to do so.
Thank you. Very good.
Thanks. Hopefully I've just invited Dominic Jackson to speak.
Hi, Richard.
Great. Hello again. Just to say, before Dominic speaks, Dominic was almost one of the founder members of Leeds for Europe before he left us to go over the Pennines to Manchester. But I never failed to drop that little drive in. So over to you, Dominic.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Richard, and thank you, Professor Grayling, for an excellent and very interesting talk. My question is around our dear Prime Minister Boris Johnson and your insight into his psyche, because we have conflicting reports about Boris Johnson. We know from insider accounts that he's utterly useless with and not bothered at all with the detailed aspects of long-term planning and policy making as Prime Minister, and he just wants the glory at the end of the day. But we also hear that he can be a Machiavellian schemer. And my question is, do you think that he is deliberately prolonging the COVID outbreak in the UK in order to keep masking the effects of Brexit and put off the day of reckoning when everybody realises this? Or do you think that he isn't clever enough to do this?
Well, I don't know Boris Johnson tremendously well personally. I do know him personally. And in fact, I know various members of his, I know Stanley Johnson and Joe Johnson, with whom I worked for a number of years when he was Minister for Higher Education and I was founding my college. I know Rachel Johnson, I know the family, and all the family, Stanley, Joe, Rachel, very, very committed Europeans and very committed Remainers and probably rejoiners now. Boris was never really a leaver, entirely a matter of political expediency. He calculated that if he could make himself the leader of the anti-European group in the Conservative Party, that the EU referendum would keep us in the EU, which he wanted, but that he could get a purchase with the right wing of the Conservative Party, and that would potentiate his chances of becoming Prime Minister at some point. That, I think, was his calculation. I think he was absolutely sick as a dog on the morning after the referendum to find that it had all gone badly wrong and that Brexit had been initiated. He's a clever man, but in my opinion, not a very intelligent one. There are two different things. He is not a detail person. He's lazy. He's all about making jokes and the big sweeping gestures. And he hasn't got a huge amount of staying power when it comes down to really hard practical issues. I think the mishandling of the COVID pandemic by this government is the result of a push me, pull me situation over the economy. There's a huge amount of anxiety about the effect on the economy because of Brexit. So the Brexit effect is weakening the economy. Trillions of dollars have fled from the City of London to the financial centers in Europe, Frankfurt and Paris and elsewhere. Businesses are leaving, and the trade situation has turned out to be horrendous with all the red tape and the delays at ports and the Northern Ireland situation. So that's already causing damage. And lockdown and trying to control the pandemic would, in the opinion of people who were concerned about this, within the government, and Boris Johnson was just, agreeing with whoever he heard last on this point, were very worried. They should think we would rather see people die than the economy tank too far. And they've gone push me, pull me on this, and they've locked down and opened up and locked down and had all these ridiculous Freedom Day slogans and so on. And this most recent Freedom Day argument is really an argument about the economy, real anxiety over the economy, which probably we wouldn't be so concerned about if we were not outside the EU. So, it's stumbling from one expedient to another, more chaos than not. And I think also we are going to see, because political events can unfold. I mean, wasn't it Harold Macmillan who said a week is a very long time in politics? That it is by no means unimaginable that before the end of this year, Boris Johnson would have been gone. There would be tremendous blood on the floor. There are a lot of Conservative MPs who are very unhappy with the situation. I mean, however much of a dyed-in-the-wool Tory you might be, and even if you were an admirer personally of Boris Johnson, you would still surely feel the most tremendous embarrassment at the exposure day after day after day after day of lies and misdirection and mishandling of the situation. It is an utter embarrassment for the country as a whole, but for members of his party and who are thinking, what effect is this going to have on us? That one thing that keeps them going, keeps them hope afloat, and keeps them loyal at the moment is the shambles in the Labour Party. That is the thing, that's the raft on which they're all hanging at the moment, given the fact that everything else is such a shambles.
Thank you. Next question is Nicholas Evans. You should be able to talk, Nicholas.
Nicholas, you're muted.
Just need to unmute, or if you don't, I'll do it for you. Okay. Right, the question is, proportional representation and electoral reform has been defeated in Parliament previously. How can majority government be persuaded to support something that is not in their nor their party's direct interest?
Okay, very useful question, this one, because we need also to be clear about what happened back in 2011 with the proposal then that the coalition partners, the Lib Dems, required, which was that there should be a referendum on the alternative vote system. Now, the alternative vote system that was mooted by the Lib Dems back in 2011 is not a genuinely proportional system of voting. It's the same one that they have for the lower house in Australia. It results in two parties, just as we have now, vying with one another. It is not a true PR system. There are a number of good PR systems. the one which is favoured by most of the responsible organisations here in the UK, is the single transferable vote system, STV, which is a very workable and very accessible, understandable system. But firstly, in 2011, the Conservative part of the coalition, which was the major partner in the coalition, were very hostile to proportional representation of any form, even of an AV system, very hostile to it. They therefore did everything they possibly could to undermine it. They put it on the same day as local elections, very, very low turnout, and no effort was made to explain it or to encourage people to take it seriously. And therefore, people didn't. They didn't really know what it was about. It didn't seem to make very much difference because it wouldn't. And people were no more bothered about it than they were about local elections. And this was a trick, really, so that people could say, oh, we had a referendum about it. We're not going to have another referendum for another generation. This is this absurd thing that you can only have a referendum on a subject once in a generation. This is the trick they want to play on us about another EU referendum. But the time for proportional representation has come. I have never, and I've been a supporter of PR all my adult thinking life, and I have never seen an occasion as rich and as full of potential for PR as now. There are so many organizations in favor of it, all working together. It is now a mainstream argument. It's now something which is front and center for the opposition, for Lib Dems and Greens and Plaid and SNP. And it is something that could have real impetus behind it if all of us work very hard to make sure that we get it right up there at the top of the agenda for the next election.
Thank you. Next question is going to be Jackie Williams-Durkin. Jackie, you should be able to talk now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, hi. Yeah, agree with everything you've said, Professor, about electoral reform. And I think perhaps like many people here, you know, pro-EU, pro-Rejoin, some of us have actually gone to groups like Make Votes Matter or Labour for a New Democracy. And I think the problem in many ways is the things that people say to you. And of course, COVID has prevented us from doing any kind of street stalls or anything to just get the message out to who you might call the general population. And I think when we have MVM meetings, and we're hoping in Leeds to have a stall at the end of the month, COVID notwithstanding, but how do we talk to people about this in terms of just getting the idea out there and engaging them? It's okay engaging with this group, but how do we, you know, we'll be on the streets of Leeds. How do we talk to people about that? I just like your ideas.
Indeed. Well, pretty much as I've been talking to you, explaining what's wrong with the current system and why we need to have proportional representation. I very often say to people, and I repeat this, I've written a couple of books just recently about democracy and what's gone wrong in our country here. And in both of them, I offer the following example. I say, think of a constituency with 100 voters and 10 people stand for election. And 8 of those people get 10 votes each. One person gets 9 votes, and the last person gets 11 votes. So who goes to Parliament? Well, the person with 11 votes. That's first past the post. The person with 11 votes goes, and 89 people are completely unrepresented. Their votes counted for nothing because they don't have a voice in Parliament. They don't have a representative there. This is fundamentally unfair. The first past the post system is fundamentally unfair. Look at the polling at the moment. The the last poll that was published last weekend, the Survation poll, put the Conservative support on 40%, and the combined support for all the other parties was 56%. And yet, the Conservative Party have an absolute 80-seat majority in the House of Commons and can do what they like, but they are a minority government. And most of the governments that we've had in this country have been minority governments. They've been elected on 35 or 40% of the electorate, and they haven't had the full support of the total electorate. And you need only go back to James Madison in the Federalist Papers I'm not recommending that you suggest this to people on the street stall, but he outlines there in the most eloquent and emphatic terms the great dangers of factionalism, where you have two factions, two parties. First past the post produces two-party warfare, simplistic slogans, divisions, and arguments such that when one party manages to get its hands on the levers of power, you get a one-party state. We've got a one-party state now. The Conservative Party is running a one-party state government. It is unfair. Now, we, the British people, care about fairness. Put the case about fairness. First past the post is deeply unfair. Most people are, the majority of people, in pretty well every general election, the majority is denied a voice, a representation, because governments are based on the minority. Now remember this, you have only to persuade or to drop a thought that might fruit in the mind of one person out of every 10 you speak to. You might speak to 10 people and 9 will abuse you and disagree with you and go off in a huff. And one person out of that 10 says, you know what, you might be right. I think I might change my mind. One person in 20, one person in 30 is enough to change the balance. Because remember, every election, every referendum is won on tiny margins. You know, you listen to that YouTube lecture that Dominic Cummings gave about how they poured all their money into the last 10 days of the referendum because they knew that there were the ins and the outs, remain and leave. There was a small group of people who hadn't yet made up their minds or who could be persuaded, and they didn't have to get all of them. They only had to get just some of them just to swing the balance, because it was a tiny little difference in actual votes cast. You have only to persuade 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. Do it. Marshal your arguments. Be clear yourself why first past the post is wrong, why we need a proportional system. If they ask you which system, say that most of the organizations like the ones you belong to go for the single transferable vote. Read up on it. There's a very clear account in Wikipedia about single transferable vote. Have the arguments ready. 1 person in 10, and we can change the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Right, next one is Nella Ashton, but I don't think she's here anymore, so I'll read it. The Tories are reforming the electoral system as we speak. When they have finished, it will be even harder for the Labour Party to get any form of working majority. What do we do to prevent this?
Well, in fact, this should be playing into our hands because yes, indeed, the Conservative government is trying to change the voting system to make it harder for many people to vote. The Boundary Commission is going to make it more difficult for Labour and opposition parties to get seats. And so we should use this fact that the current government is trying to entrench its power. It wants to be in government permanently. You know, it wants to turn this into a sort of Putin's state. And in Putin's state, they have all the cosmetic appearance of democracy, but none of the actual content of it. And we don't have the actual content of democracy here from the point of view of elected representatives actually making a difference to public policy matters. We have a putatively free press, but then the most influential press, Express, the Mail, the Telegraph, the Times, are owned by people who don't live in this country, don't pay any taxes here, billionaires who tell the newspapers what line to take. So we don't even have that aspect of a democracy. And we've got to use this fact that and then of course the Conservatives are also introducing all these very illiberal measures, like taking away judicial review of ministerial decisions so the ministers can't be held to account by we citizens taking action against them if they're not held to account by the legislature. So we can use these examples as things moving even more in the wrong direction. We've got a bad system and it's being made worse, and therefore all the more reason to fight against it and to fight for proper democratic electoral reform. You know, we have an opportunity. You want to tell people we are in a bad situation at the moment. You know, things are tanking. Our system is just, the floorboards have been rotten for a long time, but they finally collapsed. Treat this as a time of opportunity. Treat this as an opportunity for us to get substantive reforms to get us back on track. A proper democratic system, proper democratic control of the organs of government, back into the EU after that, and we would have salvaged our country, would have rescued us. We would have been the Royal National Lifeboat Institution for ourselves if we can manage that. Because if we don't have the energy and the commitment to do it, things can only get worse.
Thank you. Next question is Dee Barnfield. You should be able to talk, Dee.
Hi. Right. Hi, Professor Grayling. It's very nice to see you again. I met you briefly in Manchester many moons ago. So my question is, when we rejoin, do you think it will be the UK as a whole, or might one of the four nations get there first?
Well, you know, I said at the very outset that there are two inevitable routes back into the EU, the longer term one and this one that I'm advocating, the short term activist one. In the scenario, the longer term scenario, I think it is now close to inevitability that there will be Scottish independence and that Scotland will be back in the EU before the rump of the UK is. But if that happens, then an independent Scotland in the EU will be a very, very powerful pull for the rump of the UK to rejoin the EU. So that actually would, in its indirect way, be a help. Now, I was a unionist, not a conservative unionist, but somebody who, because I have two English grandparents, one of them a Yorkshireman, by the way, so I still support Yorkshire Cricket Club, one Welsh and one Scottish, okay, so I'm about as British as you know, around the island as you can get, and I wanted us all to be one thing, and I don't like the bad kinds of nationalism, you know, I mean, that just seems to me to be a source of divisions and conflicts and so on. But since the Brexit referendum, I have completely switched round 180 degrees, and I now think it is a travesty that our Scotland should have been dragged in this direction by England against its will and against its interests. And therefore now I think if we don't rejoin the EU within 6 years, I think it would be quite right and proper and indeed helpful to the rest of us if Scotland became independent and rejoined the EU.
Thank you.
Thanks. You've almost answered the next question, which has just shot up the charts from Morag Williamson. I'll let Morag just intervene, just in case you want to add anything or elaborate on the question you've got. So hold on, Morag, I'll just find you and I'll allow you to talk if you just want to say anything.
Oh yes, thanks for letting me add a bit there. Thanks for that question, Dee, and thanks Professor Grayling for that answer, which did largely answer my own question, which is, will Scottish independence be the shock that England needs to start to reform and recover from its current collapse? And will Scotland's post-India accession to the EU light a path for England to rejoin in its own right? That was my question. And if I could just add, I actually think that this is a good argument for everyone to support Scottish independence, as from the point of view of it being a factor in helping reform come faster in England and the rest of the UK. So I want Scottish independence, not just for us in Scotland, but because I think it can be helpful for the rest of the UK.
Well, I'm with you 100% on that. I think that is absolutely right. And by the way, I do think that if we get our electoral reform and we get our referendum and we're back in the EU, and then things start to settle down a bit and we begin to have a proper, mature-minded, careful look at our constitutional arrangements more generally in this country and the relationships between the different nations in the British Isles, then I think even though, as we've seen from the example of Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process there, which is made possible by the fact that we were all in the EU together and that it completely drained you know, the worst excesses of conflict and difference there. And the same thing would happen, I think. But I think Scottish, much greater Scottish autonomy, if not complete autonomy, but within the EU, because from a practical point of view, it could make no difference to people living north and south of Britain. You may remember back in the 18th century, Britain used to be called Scotland used to be called North Britain and England used to be called South Britain, England and Wales. Well, the idea that North Britain and South Britain would both be parts of the EU, parts of the same family, would mean that things like freedom of movement between the two, trading relations, standards, regulations, all that would be exactly the same. So that in effect, it would make no difference whether there was a formal independence or not. But your point is an extremely good one. If we're still outside the EU, there is a independence for Scotland and they rejoin, that will be a major shake-up, and it would be a powerful pull to bring the rest of the UK back into the EU.
Brilliant, brilliant, thank you, brilliant.
Thanks. I think we're almost out of time. I don't know if we've got time for one more, Anthony. I don't want to overstretch your evening, but this is a slightly different question, so I think it's worth taking it on, and I'll allow Chris Reed to read his question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
And yes.
Can you hear me? Hello, thank you, Professor Grayling. I was at your talk about just before lockdown at the Leeds Library, where quite a lot of things, same things came up. I share all your views, maybe not all your optimism, and my question is about that. If we do manage to bring Britain round, but maybe only to say 60-40, have another referendum, win 60-40, do you think the EU will really open us back with open arms if it doesn't think that we've actually managed to beat off the anti-EU sentiment in Britain? Because if I was French and I thought Britain had only gone 60-40 and might go back the other way, I might not be that keen. And of course, all countries have a veto on new members coming back in again.
Well, I don't think that we will be able to get back in on the same remarkably generous terms that we had before the referendum. We had what some people have called a Germany plus arrangement, a completely ideal cherry-picked arrangement, all the benefits and none of the burdens. We had a completely sort of free ride as members of the EU, and that I don't think will happen. I know from talking to people in Brussels and people in the EU Commission and Parliament and so on, that the attitude of more reflective people in Europe, the people with whom we exchange ideas and so on, they appreciate the fact that there is such a lot of pro-EU sentiment in the UK. They don't think of the UK as a whole. They're not simple-minded. They don't think that the entire British population is hostile to Europe. They think this right-wing conservative government and Boris Johnson and Foster and these people who've made such a mess of things are unreliable, untrustworthy, dishonest, and they find it very difficult to deal with them. Lazy, sort of underprepared and dishonest, and they don't like them. But the simple fact is that the longer we are out of the EU, the much more likely it is that rejoining will require, I don't know, signing up for some things that we are not ready to sign up for yet here. It's not impossible that it might be a condition of membership in future that we join Schengen or the Euro. Plenty of people here in the UK would be perfectly happy to do both those things. Plenty of people not. Plenty of people were very happy with EU membership as it was, and people in Europe understand that fact. There will be some things that our European friends are pleased to be able to do now that they haven't got the drag anchor of UK governments frightened of their own anti-Euro wings, political party wings. But they will be relieved if we have proportional representation, a much more reflective parliament, coalition government here. EU sentiment is very strong here. We're one of the most pro-EU countries in Europe, in fact, as a result of Brexit, as you know. They understand that, and they won't want to be imposing on us conditions that make it difficult for us to rejoin, because they want us to rejoin. They want us to be part of Europe. We're still a pretty big economy. We have a great deal to offer. Historically, the connection between the different nations of the British Isles and the different nations on the European continent are very strong in very many different ways. And therefore, when this storm is past, this debacle that we're in at the moment, and all the obfuscations introduced by COVID and the rest of it, if we get our electoral reform and we get our say, and the say is that we want to be back in, we know, we can be very confident that our European friends and partners will welcome us back in, and they will help us come back in ways that make it possible for us to be back in.
Thanks very much. Very good. I will just like to invite Peter Burke to come in. Oh, sorry, before I do that, Peter, if you just be on standby. I just want to thank very much indeed Anthony Grayling for speaking to us tonight. Really, as I kind of expected, and I think a lot of us expected, it's gets us all fired up and optimistic. Sorry, phone ringing. So thank you so much for that. It's given us plenty to think about. I mean, the electoral reform thing, I must admit, I've always been a little bit skeptical about it, in the sense that is it too much to take on two major battlefronts at the same time? But you've persuaded me quite well, actually, that it is the way forward, and it certainly opened the door to the idea of having a balanced government, a balanced parliament would really make that possible. So, sorry, I apologise for that. Oh God.
Richard, while you're struggling with whatever it is that's creeping up on you there, can I just say one final thing to everybody present? And that is this. Politics and the whole debate about Brexit and the EU and everything else is about people's thoughts, people's decisions, people's choices. It's not about, you know, moving a mountain of solid rock or draining the oceans. It's about people. It's about discussion. It's about changing minds. It's about argument. And it is possible to change enough minds and to get people to move in the right direction, enough people to move in the right direction to make things happen. And anything which is possible can be turned into something that is actual. So this is just about people. It's about discussion. It's about persuasion. It's possible. What I've described to you tonight is genuinely possible. I'm not saying it's easy. I don't believe that proportional representation and proportional parliaments are perfect. Nothing is perfect in our human world. I don't think the EU is perfect by a long chalk. There are plenty of things that need to be done there either. It's a hell of a lot better than being outside the EU. So, it's about people, it's about possibility, and anything possible can be made actual. Just have the determination, want to do it, work for it, and we can make it happen.
Yes, certainly, and there's certainly plenty of determination here, and I think amongst our participants, because I've been dealing with the great people here for a long time, and I know that there's still a real passion for what we're about, and that hasn't diminished at all. In fact, I think it's increasing. So thank you very much again, Anthony. Great to see you again. I know you're doing a few of these, so really I think it does a good boost for our movement and for morale, and as we're coming out of COVID, hopefully, and we can start to plan the way forward in various ways. The thing I would add to that is that I see signs that Brexit is falling apart in front of our eyes. The government has started to talk about Brexit red tape today, which they were challenged, and they said, did you mean to say Brexit red tape? Because it implies that you think Brexit is bad in some way. And number 10 Downing Street said, yes, we meant what we said. There's a thing called Brexit red tape. So, that's them admitting themselves that it's problematic at the very least. And obviously the Northern Ireland, now they're effectively talking about renegotiating Brexit, which is what we've wanted all along, to renegotiate it in quite a major way. So the idea that Brexit is done, they've abandoned that as well. So there's various big cracks appearing in Brexit, and I think it gives us reason to be rejuvenated and to look ahead about how we're going to take things forward. So speaking of which, I've invited Peter Burke to just do a little plug for next week's webinar, which again is going to be joint between Grassroots for Europe and a local group, which is Oxford for Europe. Peter, you there?
Well, thank you, Richard. Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
So just, to add to what you've said, as usual, Professor Grayling put himself forward with huge clarity and articulacy and brilliance. And I think I would go along with almost everything you've said there. I can speak with experience on the question of STV, because I'm currently in Dublin, and STV has been normal here for years, and it works. and it means every single voter is enfranchised, which unfortunately doesn't happen in the UK. And curious enough, in Northern Ireland, it's been used in various ways as well, including the European elections. But the main thing I was going to say to you is that following on from that cri de coeur and that really call to arms on the question of rejoining, we have Andrew Donis coming on Tuesday, 27th, and at 7:30, Oxford for Europe, and he'll be building on that theme. It's called Step by Step Towards Rejoin. You can find all the details if you go to our website, oxfordforeurope.org. And can I also just say to those many people whose questions didn't get asked, you will have a further opportunity to ask Professor Grayling, I hope, those questions, because he's kindly agreed to be our speaker jointly with Hampshire for Europe and Berkshire for Europe on the 18th of next month. And we very much look forward to hearing that too. So with that, I'll hand back to Richard. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And just to wrap up, I mean, some people may not be currently in contact with Grassroots for Europe or Leeds for Europe, depending on whether you are closer to Leeds or closer to the whole of the UK. If you'd like to stay in touch with either of those organisations and what we're doing, and as you've just heard, there's events happening all the time of this nature, and in the future there'll be events in the real world. Please do drop me an email, richard@grassrootsforeurope.org, and I'll happily put you on your chosen mailing list, and you'll be kept up to speed with all the future events, and there will be more. We're doing something almost every week, and we want to keep the momentum going. So thank you all very much for attending. It's been great attendance, nearly 200 people on the call. So as I said, that shows the passion that still exists here, and thank you all for that. And we'll have a good evening, and thank you again, Professor Grayling.